Спасибо большое, господин Усаев. Я, во-первых, хотел объясниться за то, что, представляя вас, я назвал о другом проекте. Просто, понимаете, друзья, все проекты колоссально очень успешные, они все сидят как бы в голове у нас и вертятся на языке. И примите вот мои слова как предложение развивать дальнейшие проекты в области энергетики. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо.
Коллеги, позвольте представить следующее слово госпоже Джилл Джеймсон, руководителю проекта в рамках макроэкономического проекта «Юсаид». Тема доклада «Меняющийся ландшафт инфраструктурного и проектного финансирования». Буквально несколько слов. Данный проект работает совместно с Центром ВЧП и Министерством экономического развития и торговли достаточно успешно, и большой вклад получает в развитие конкретных проектов в социальной сфере, в агентственной сфере. И плюс есть очень серьезное предложение в качестве улучшения нашего законодательства. Спасибо.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, good afternoon, добрый день, I think is correct. It's nice to see you today. It's my honor and my pleasure to be speaking with you. I'm here today in representation of USAID's macroeconomic project, which is assisting the government of Kazakhstan to diversify its economy through expanded trade, increased private sector participation, as well as macroeconomic policy. So we do a great many things, but under this umbrella, we likewise are working with the government of Kazakhstan at both the central level, as well as at the regional level on public-private partnerships. And under the auspices of this USAID project, as well as a previous project, I've had the opportunity to meet many of you in this room at both the central and regional level. I've met representatives of all 16 regions of Kazakhstan. I've been to many of those regions, and I really do believe that I understand the promise as well as the potential and expectations that the country has for public-private partnerships. I certainly applaud the efforts today. They have been extraordinary. There have been efforts since 2006 to put Kazakhstan on the right track in PPP. But despite these labors, it is still evident that Kazakhstan has room to grow. It's still in the very early stages of PPP program development, which means it's filled with potential and a great future that we can all embrace together. If you look at the graphic here, we often in PPP refer to the PPP market maturity curve, and countries will move along this curve as they develop their PPP markets. In stage one, which is the early stage, it's when countries are basically establishing their policy and legislative framework. They generally will institutionalize PPP through a centralized PPP unit, as we have in Kazakhstan, as well as perhaps with advisory guidance units as well. They may develop basic deal structures like concessions, and the priority is to get transactions right and establish the standards for PPP development. It's also about developing a local marketplace for PPP, establishing the banks, making sure they get the right financial services to support a vibrant PPP program. As you move up in the second stage, it's when countries have really, they've got their PPP program on the right footing, and it's now about consolidation and expansion of their PPP program. This is where you'll see satellite units developing in line ministries, all of the regions. There'll be the development of hybrid delivery models. You'll expand and shape the local PPP marketplace. And likewise, you tend to leverage new funding sources, like the capital markets. And that's usually done through the refinancing of first-generation PPPs. The third stage is really, we talked a little bit about it here today, it's really your more advanced and sort of very developed PPP programs, such as Australia, the United Kingdom, try to apply PPP in accordance with international best practice. And I do think that this is the right mandate. This is what Kazakhstan needs to do in order to attract serious long-term investment and to put itself as a leader on the global forefront of PPP. Kazakhstan, however, is launching its PPP program or expanding it in a very, very complicated time in history. A few other speakers today have talked about the international financial crisis, and we can't ignore it. It's the big white elephant sitting in the room that we need to look at. The financial crisis has changed the underlying economics of public-private partnerships. On the one hand, it's gained prestige. Everybody loves public-private partnerships these days because it is both popular with those who are those who promote fiscal austerity as well as those who promote fiscal stimulus. You can argue this from either side of the coin. It is a good thing to be doing right now. For all of us in this room, it's a very good industry for us to be in. But on the flip side of that, really, everything has changed. We have a lack of long-term credit markets. We have sort of a changing panorama in terms of who is funding the supply and demand side of PPP infrastructure finance. So within this context, Kazakhstan needs to position itself well. It needs to think very strategically and very competitively about how it is going to distinguish itself from all the other nations that are fighting for the investment dollars of the few and the far. We've seen one thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, across the globe since the financial crisis hit. And this is what we call a flight to quality. Investors are seeking quality transactions. It doesn't matter where they are. They want good, solid fundamentals, something clear where they can identify the risks. They know where the returns are coming from. Those projects are still getting financed, as I'll show you here in a moment. They're running away from anything confusing or wherever they cannot really determine what the risk categorization will be. Now, I've heard some people in Kazakhstan tell me, probably none of them are in this room, so I can speak further, that Kazakhstan is unique. We cannot apply international best practice in Kazakhstan. Don't even think about it. We are a unique country, they tell me. They claim that Kazakhstan doesn't need to attract international investors because it has its own money. And I recognize this. There's a great deal of money inside of Kazakhstan that can indeed be invested into infrastructure. But allow me, if you will, to make a few comments on that. And this would be the comment that I hope that you remember about this entire speech. The same financial rules of gravity apply in Kazakhstan as apply in the rest of the universe. I'll repeat that. The same financial rules of gravity apply in Kazakhstan as in the rest of the universe. A poorly designed transaction is not going to be attractive for local investors if it's not attractive for international investors. You need to get the basics right, particularly in transaction design. You don't want to unload bad projects on your local investors, particularly pension funds, local banks, etc. The fiscal implications of poorly designed transactions can be enormously negative on Kazakhstan in the future. So even though Kazakhstan is unique, you still need to apply the same fundamentals. Secondly, the local financial infrastructure in Kazakhstan is not yet ready to invest in all of the projects that are in the pipeline. I was in Geneva with the National PPP Center at the UN conference, and they announced a very ambitious pipeline of projects. I think it was $10 billion over 5 years, or $5 billion over 10 years. And I wish you all the luck in the world, and I'm rooting for you, and I will help you in any way I can. Your local financial markets, your local banks, cannot assume that much project finance risk on their own. You're going to have to reach out to the international investment community. And likewise, The changing landscape of infrastructure finance, very quickly. Before the crisis, there was limited money going into infrastructure, very high construction costs, as we all saw, and the fiscal dynamics were encouraging governments to explore new alternative delivery models, such as PPP. After the crisis, however, we do see an infusion of public money into infrastructure again. It's part of the stimulus package. But this is also coupled with fiscal distress, which is requiring governments to continue looking to private sector financing. But on the supply side of infrastructure finance, this is where we've really seen a great deal of change. Before we had well-functioning debt capital markets, we had very solid project financing markets, strong equity investors, and we also were seeing, before the crisis, the emergence of infrastructure funds. After the crisis, we have very challenged debt markets, price and tenor restraints in terms of being able to finance long-term debt instruments. Many of our equity investors have been sidelined due to financial crisis, and yet we're still seeing a very strong upsurge in infrastructure funds across the globe, which are actually helping push PPP forward in many, many areas. So there has been a change, and if we look at this slide, it summarizes some of the recent capital structures. And I won't go through this, but we are seeing a few trends. One, as I mentioned, we have a flight to quality transactions. Since the crisis, we've seen some startling project failures. And I will point to my own country, the United States, for the Midway Airport failure, unable to find financing, hugely embarrassing to the city of Chicago, which I'm not from, by the way. But we've also seen some spectacular successes. And we look at St. Petersburg Airport, we can look at some of these others like I-95 in the state of Florida. Higher equity requirements, we're seeing much higher equity than we saw before the crisis, which is also making it more necessary to find the right financial sponsors for these projects in terms of operators. But the market marches on, and I'll point to one that I think is very surprising to see in this list, and that is Pristina International Airport in Kosovo. Kosovo is a country that most countries don't recognize, has no credit history, never done PPP before, and actually with USAID's assistance at the peak of the financial crisis was able to concession its first area